Welcome back, everyone, as we continue our way through the story of the 1918 and 19 flu pandemic that hit the world, killed something like 5% of the world's population. If you haven't seen the first 3 episodes, there's a link in the description that will take you back to episode 1. As always, I encourage you to check out Extra History, the original content creator of the video that we'll be using for our discussion today. Please support them. They have a lot of great stuff. I think some of the best historical content in all of YouTube world. They have a great way of telling a story. It's really well done, and that's why I use them so often. The latest episode from my trip to Gettysburg in November is up. It is the story of what happened after the battle, to the dead, to the horses, to the ammunition and the weapons, things of that nature. If you want to check that out, there will be a link at the end of the video to that video, but there is a full 7-video playlist of the events that I experienced while I was there for a couple of days. I do also have an upcoming series that I shot the day before I went to Gettysburg, which should be 6 or 7 videos from Arlington National Cemetery. I was there for 9 hours, and I walked 9.5 miles around the cemetery while I was there. Did as much as I absolutely could. So hopefully I'll be able to start bringing some of that to you very soon. I leave in 6 days for France. Excited. You've been hearing me talk about that. But let's go ahead and dive into today's episode.
September 28th, Philadelphia. The Liberty Loan Parade is in full swing. Thousands march in the streets. Hundreds of thousands watch. Few know that health officials have pressured the mayor to cancel the event. Women wave flags. A child sits on his father's shoulders. The crowd falls silent for a simulated bombing run. Airplanes buzz overhead. Anti-aircraft guns fire blanks into the sky. The crowd, necks craned, tries to imagine what it's like to be in mortal peril.
So trying to imagine what it's like in mortal peril, my son saved up a bunch of money for the last year and a half or so. He's like one of those kids who gets money for his birthday or for Christmas, but then doesn't immediately spend it like most of us do. And he saved it and saved it and saved it, and he finally decided what he wanted to do with all this money he'd been saving from mowing lawns and birthdays and Christmases and things like that, and he bought an Oculus Quest 2. And so I borrowed it from him to do Dan Carlin's World War I experience. It's not very long, but boy, was it intense. You know, you're in this VR headset and you're experiencing what it's like in the trench, and you see guys die right in front of you, and it was dark and it was scary, and an artillery shell hit in front of me and it made me jump, and it was so intense. I don't think that we can understand what it was like for these guys to be on the front lines. I'm going to do everything I can when I go to France to try and understand it, but I know I'll never get there. I can't possibly fathom what it was like to be under one of those artillery barrages. But this goes back to what we said in the first episode, is that World War I was the catalyst that allowed this disease to spread. And even when it's not directly involving troops, you see that. Here they're having a big parade for Liberty loans, which was a way of getting the public to support the war effort, to finance it. So same thing happened in World War II, all the bond drives and things like that, getting people to invest, to spend money so the government didn't have to go deeply into debt to fund the war, which was massively expensive. And so even now you have parades, you have large gatherings of people because of the war. And it's going to be another one of those super spreader events.
Little do they know, they already are.
Already are in danger.
The flu was already burning in Philadelphia, but after the Liberty Loan Parade, it explodes. 3 days later, the hospitals start to fill. With the war sapping medical professionals, there aren't enough doctors or nurses, and the hospital staff starts to die. Though colleagues fall around them, doctors and nurses stay at their posts. Some in private practice make 60 house calls a day.
We said it yesterday, and I'll say it again. These medical professionals, heroes, absolute heroes. It's always been that way, going all the way back to the times of the plague, when people would risk their own lives to treat people that were dealing with these diseases. And it's absolutely true today as we deal with another pandemic. Absolute heroes for what they're doing.
Over 1,000 die that first week, and in 3 weeks, the death toll approaches 5,000. The dead quickly begin to overwhelm Philadelphia. Morticians post staff at hospitals to free up beds the moment victims expire.
Jeez.
If a patient starts turning blue, nurses tag them for the morgue. It saves time.
Could you imagine that? The moment they start turning blue, they know. Had a similar conversation with someone. I don't want to reveal these, like, who it is or where they work, things like that, but basically told me our IC, this was a while back, not during the current stage of all of this, but a couple of months ago they said, our ICU is full of men in their 40s. They're on ventilators, and every one of them is going to die. Like, they knew. These people are treating these people, and they know what the outcome is. They've seen it over and over again, and that's the case here. And it's such a desperate situation that they're triaging these people. The moment they start showing signs of what is going to kill them, they prepare to get them moved out so they can move in the next person that they hopefully can save.
But the morgue is out of space and refuses to accept more bodies. Workers keep doors and windows open to dissipate the stench, and fluid runs out the door and into the gutter.
Ugh.
The Catholic Church gets involved, mobilizing clergy to help clear the backlog. When the priests enter the morgue, they find 400 bodies. They're everywhere. Lying on desks and stacked in corners, the building is at 12 times its maximum capacity. Things are no better at graveyards. Pre-burial vaults are full. The city has run out of coffins and wood to build coffins. People use
So he mentions pre-burial vaults. You go to a lot of older cemeteries, and they have what's called a receiving vault, which is basically the place that they would put a body until it was ready for burial. Because sometimes, a lot of these bigger city cemeteries, people, it would take time to prepare a grave, and when you're digging that many graves, it takes a while for you to get one ready. And a lot of folks would have tombs built. So, for example, you go to the cemetery that is right next to where William McKinley was buried after he was assassinated, and there's a receiving vault there where he lay for several years, before they had built his tomb that they eventually put him in. Same thing happened with Abraham Lincoln. Same thing happened with a lot of people throughout the years.
Barrows and potato sacks to bring loved ones to the cemetery, then leave them there. Once again, the church steps in, hiring a construction crew to dig trenches with steam shovels. They stack the coffins 2 deep while recording exactly where each person is buried. At night, citizens hear them reciting Latin prayers over the mass grave. But that took time to organize. And for weeks, thousands are not buried at all. With hospitals, morgues...
And that's going to create a new health crisis, because now you've got the issue of bodies stacking up and decaying, and they're carrying the disease themselves. I don't know how long it lives in a body afterwards, but then there's other diseases that you have to be concerned about at this point. It's a major public health crisis all the way around.
And cemeteries refusing to accept corpses, people have to live with the dead in their homes.
Oh.
And many families are so ill that they can't move a corpse at all and simply sleep, eat, and live next to the deceased. Weeks in, Philadelphia...
There was a story I read a month or so ago. I mean, obviously we're not dealing to anything to this degree, at least here in the United States, but I believe it was in Pennsylvania where they found 3 siblings, I think in their 60s. All dead in different parts of the property. One was in the living room or the kitchen. One was out, like in a trailer in the yard that they were living in, and one was in a bedroom or something. And they had all died at about the same time from the same thing in the pandemic that we're currently experiencing.
Field leaders finally rent a warehouse as an overflow morgue. Organized teams of policemen and priests circle the city, collecting the dead in horse-drawn carts. Philadelphia would be the worst hit city in America, with 500,000 cases. By the end of October...
I want to take a look at something real quick. It had me thinking when it first mentioned Philadelphia. Obviously, the largest cities today in America are not the largest cities in 1918, so I want to take a look at that. So at the time of the 1910 census, we have, for those not familiar, we have a census every 10 years in the United States, and it's always on the year ending in 0, 1910, 1920, 1930, etc. I know in the UK they do it on the year ending in 1, so 1911, 1921, 1931. So at the time, the last census before the flu pandemic, New York is the largest with 4.7 million. Chicago comes next with 2.1 million. And then Philadelphia was the third largest city in America with 1.5 million. So maybe 40% of the population got the flu in that outbreak. And then you have a huge drop. You go to St. Louis, Boston, Cleveland at 500,000. And then it kind of goes down from there. But you can see Philadelphia right there. And that's a huge... the number of people who got the flu in Philadelphia would have been the sixth largest city in America at 600,000 people. Just unimaginable.
October, the city government almost ceased to function, and private citizens stepped in to run the response. People volunteered cars as ambulances and worked as dispatchers at medical phone banks.
Everyone's stepping up.
911. But just up the coast, it was a different story. While the head of New York's Board of Health had been slow to respond, the city had experience fighting epidemics like polio and tuberculosis. The Public Health Service had
That looked like they were fighting a pickle. I don't know.
Experience fighting epidemics like polio and tuberculosis. The Public Health Service had a major presence and experience screening and quarantining people at the Port of New York. In fact, the port had started quarantining ships the moment reports of the flu arose on the Western Front.
So New York has always been the major port of arrival for immigrants. It wasn't the only port. People came to Baltimore, Philadelphia, Boston, other places, but New York was always the major one. And Ellis Island, which is what everybody in America thinks of, my family came over to Ellis Island. Well, Ellis Island only opened, I think, in the 1890s, which if you go there today, it's right next to where the Statue of Liberty is. You can technically get to Ellis Island by land from the New Jersey side because it's right there next to. I think they have land connections for people who work there. But so Ellis Island in 1890s. Before that, it was a place called Castle Clinton, which is actually over in Manhattan, New York, and it's actually the place today that you go downtown to get your tickets to go see the Statue of Liberty. But they did. They would quarantine people. If you showed any signs of any kind of diseases, they would quarantine you until you were healthy enough to be allowed into the country. Otherwise, you stayed there at Ellis Island. They did have experience with this.
But the war made full quarantine impossible. The city instituted laws criminalizing spitters and people who failed to cover their mouths when they coughed or sneezed.
Really?
They posted notices urging the sick to stay home under voluntary quarantine, report illnesses to a doctor, and they called for people to wear gauze masks. The Board of Health surveyed neighborhoods to track the spread. They set up medical centers that dispatched doctors and nurses on house calls. And most importantly, they convinced businesses to stagger working hours and shopping times, reducing crowds on public transit. But even in New York,
sound familiar?
The press...
I mean, let's recognize this for what it is. This is a place that we learned a lot. I mean, a lot of what you see happening today that has happened in the last 2 years, these were lessons that were learned in places like New York and others from how they dealt with the flu pandemic.
Continued to minimize the outbreak in order to protect morale. And it was the same in cities and towns across America, even as the disease spread west. Newspapers would claim there was nothing to worry about one day, and then the next announced that all public gathering places were closed. The result was uncertainty and fear. Everyone knew newspapers were covering it up. People could see the obituaries. They saw the Red Cross ads begging for nurses. Families tracked the flu coming down the rail line or highway via letters and articles buried in the back pages. It was in the next state, the next county, the next town, and finally next door. In this climate of mistrust, rumors grew. One conspiracy theory...
Always happens, right? I mean, we talked about that yesterday a little bit. Anytime you have things like this happen, especially now when you're in 1918, 1919, and you're starting to have mass media, word can travel fast because you've got, at this point, you've got radio. And so you're able to, you have wireless transmissions, so you're able to spread word quickly to places. You can get news across the Atlantic almost instantly. So it's a different world, and this news travels despite the best attempts to keep it quiet.
Theory claimed the flu was a bioweapon released from German U-boats off the Atlantic coast. Another said that the German-owned Bayer Corporation had poisoned its aspirin with the disease. A rumor ran around Phoenix that dogs carried the disease, and as a result, Arizonians killed thousands of strays and pets. And in San Francisco, a policeman shot a man who refused to comply with new flu mask laws. Evangelist...
So, I saw a news story a couple of nights ago, and listen, when I mentioned the other day that I didn't want people talking about what was going on with modern things, I didn't mean that we couldn't observe and recognize the parallels that exist and things like that. What I was hoping to avoid, and you guys have been fantastic with doing this, is I don't want us to get to devolve into arguments about policies that are in place, whether or not they're good or bad, about things like vaccine mandates and all that stuff. There's a time and a place for that discussion. I just don't want it here. But I saw a news story the other day about how a flight had to turn around from Miami to London because somebody wouldn't put their stupid mask on. And, that kind of stuff just frustrating because you had to have gone through the airport with the mask on. You had to have worn the mask when you got on the plane. I don't get it. But this shows you how extreme that can get. Somebody got shot because they wouldn't wear their mask. Wow.
Billy Sunday claimed the disease was a punishment visited upon a sinful nation and held a mass prayer meeting to end the epidemic. Several in the crowd collapsed of flu while praying for deliverance. Whole towns isolated themselves, hiring armed guards. The flu got in anyway, arriving with mailmen and milk trucks. Shops began asking customers to shout their orders, then leave the money on the doorstep. The owner would take the money and leave the goods.
I can't help but think of Seinfeld, the soup Nazi, or no soup for you. You have to walk up, shout your order, and then move on down. And in this case, they're shouting the order from outside, leave the money there. And, it's kind of similar to today. You still have, contactless ordering, right? So, I can order from Walmart my grocery order, and they'll leave it on the steps, and I never even, see the person who delivers my groceries, that kind of thing.
Children distilled this paranoia into a jump rope rhyme, one that captured the sense of an unwanted visitor invading the home.
I had a little bird and her name was Enza. I opened up the window and influenza.
The country needs...
That was super disturbing. And it reminds me of the fact that, the other kids' rhyme, Ring Around the Rosie, which has its roots in the Black Death, the plague. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. That's what that's based on, is a pandemic.
Something to stop this nightmare. At the Rockefeller Institute, they isolate Pfeiffer's bacillus in mid-October, and the Army Medical School begins the process of injecting it into horses, drawing their blood, and isolating the antibodies for a vaccine. By October 25th, the vaccine is ready. Express trains rush deliveries to the West Coast to protect troops and shipbuilders there. They've made enough to vaccinate the entire U.S. Army and its civilian employees.
A lot of parallels again, right? Rushing to get a vaccine together and hurrying to try and put a stop to this.
But only enough for the Army. For the duration of the war, the Rockefeller Institute was a military organization, and therefore their work focused on the military. No matter how much mayors and governors begged for vaccine, they wouldn't receive a single vial. It took a parallel civilian effort to provide relief to the public. At the New York Hygienic Lab, Williams labors over lung samples from hospitals and orphanages, trying to find whether Pfeiffer's exists in a majority of victims. And she finds it. Everywhere. She isolates a sample and proves antibodies can bind to it, further confirming it was the culprit.
So, hey, once again, it's the women coming through, man. A brilliant woman doing the job. And, I've been doing some research this week for my trip to France, and one of the videos I'm going to be highlighting the work of women who served as nurses over there. And, this is a time when women didn't even have the right to vote, but they're serving heroically and in many cases dying on the front lines for a country. And the same thing with the black troops. I can't help but think of the Harlem Hellfighters, people who are fighting for their country while their country treats them as second-class citizens. It's just, good for them.
That done, she cultures vast quantities of Pfeiffers, liter upon liter, then hands them off to Park, who rushes upstate to mass-produce vaccine at his farm. Deep down, researchers knew this was not good science. The process had been too fast. No one really knew whether Pfeiffer's caused the flu. And if, as some suspected, the culprit was a virus invisible to microscopes, These vaccines would do nothing. It was, one researcher said, like fighting a ghost. Still, it was worth trying.
Yeah, people are desperate. They want something that they hope can slow this thing down. There were some people that thought the entire world population was going to get wiped out and that nobody would be left. This thing would keep mutating and keep killing until everybody was gone. And so they're desperate to try and find a solution.
There was a possibility they'd accidentally snare the disease-causing agent in their sample, and the horses would make antibodies for it. That was how the first rabies vaccine happened, after all. In fact, one Rockefeller researcher counted on this, producing a vaccine that contained antibodies for every bacteria he could find, all mixed together, hoping that one would stop the disease.
A vaccine cocktail. I don't know, that sounds kind of dangerous to me.
Even as they rolled out the vaccine, Surgeon General Gorgas cautioned it was experimental, and no one knew if it would work. And it didn't. Labs across the country produced dozens of vaccines, and none of them prevented flu. Because flu was, as some feared, an invisible virus.
Yep.
Yet despite that failure, medical science was not helpless. They could do little for patients killed directly by the flu, the ones that turned blue, but they could fight the opportunistic pneumonias that followed it. The anti-pneumonia vaccine in serum Avery had worked on during the earlier measles epidemic was effective.
See, and that's, again, thinking outside the box. All right, we can't stop the virus, but the virus isn't necessarily what's killing people. It's what the virus causes to have happen. We saw that in the first episode with my wife's great-grandmother. It wasn't the influenza that killed her. It was the influenza weakening her body, allowing pneumonia to kill her. So treat the pneumonia. Treat the things that influenza leads to.
And likely saved some people. Thousands of troops took it. On the surgical side, doctors developed a new procedure to enter the lungs and drain the sacs of pus that drowned patients. Others used oxygen, x-rays, and cardiac stimulants to support ailing victims. But nurses provided the most valuable care.
As they usually do.
There were too few doctors, too many patients, not enough medicine, and what treatments they had often took too long to administer en masse. Nurses, on the other hand, could keep patients hydrated, warm, and breathing comfortably. They could ease coughs and lower temperatures. And that kind of long-term care probably affected a patient's survival more than anything a doctor could do in the few minutes they had at each bedside. Added to that, the Red Cross developed a system that predicted the flu's cycle of infection, when it would die down in one area and spring up in another, letting them deploy emergency teams of nurses before they were needed. But as everyone from city officials and the Red Cross responded to the crisis, there was one man who refused to do anything. President Wilson.
Yeah. Him. Y'all know how much I love this guy. Here's one more reason why. He wasn't just a flaming racist who screened Klan movies in the White House and endorsed them and made federal policies that didn't allow blacks to be able to even have jobs in the federal government and all of those sorts of things.
When briefed about the deadly influenza outbreak, the one question on his mind was whether he should order the troop ships to continue ferrying soldiers to France. He did, and the flu kept killing.
Okay, anyway, with that note, we're going to wrap this one up for the day. I believe there are 2 more episodes. I think there's 6 altogether, so let me know your thoughts. As always, use the comment section below to let me know something you learned today, or share something with us that can add to the conversation. We're all here to learn together. If you like this and you want to see more things like this, please hit that like button. And right after you see the screen thanking our patrons, you're going to see links, including a link to the latest Gettysburg video. Please check that out. Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching.